Howdy, and welcome to the F1 Hatchet. And welcome to the summer break. We only get a short summer break this time, so we only have 3 weeks to play with. So I'm going to do a 3-tiered system to try to go through all the teams and try to give you a little quick summary of where they are at this point in the season. This first video will go through ranked 10 through 7, to try to give you that feel for those bottom 4 teams and where they line up potentially with each other, and how those drivers are lining up within each team themselves. So we'll start off with Alpine, who is, of course, in 10th position currently in the constructor standings. They have averaged a starting position of 14 and averaged a finishing position of 15. So they're dropping a position during the race on average. Now, this does not include sprint races, as we've only had 3 sprint races this season. So those will have to wait till after the full season before we get a look at those. They've also already had 6 DNFs for the Alpine team, so they are not looking good at all in that general sense, because if you can't finish a race, there's no chance of getting points. And if you don't get points, then you drop down as other people get those points instead of you. So as here you can see, Alpine is struggling quite a bit. They're starting off lower than they were last year, and they don't even gain that position back like we saw some other teams do during the race. So they're actually losing positions during the race, which is, that feel of that car is dropping back. So that means that they can qualify a little bit better, but the race pace is not quite there for them. And then we come to Haas, who's now in 9th place. Their starting position is farther back in 15th, but they are gaining a couple spots during the races and finishing on average in 13th. So they are doing quite well in that regard. So yes, they're not quite starting up closer to those points range, but they are gaining a couple extra positions. And so when things fall out, they can get to those points on a more consistent basis than Alpine has. And they have only had 3 DNFs, the lowest of the 4 teams. So they're doing fairly well in that regard as well. We have Racing Bulls, who are now in 8th in the constructor standings. And they have a nice starting position of 11th, so they started up there right next to those points. But unfortunately, they're dropping back down into that 13th position overall for average. So they're kind of dropping a little bit in that case, and so they're kind of dropping out of the points. And so if they can get their act together from their qualifying sessions, then they should be able to take advantage of that and get that extra position, hopefully, and get some more points on average than the other team. So they're looking good, and they're kind of moving forward in that regard. Yet they still have 5 DNFs total, so they're looking kind of sketchy in that regard of trying to finish the race. So hopefully their consistency comes back, and they're not going to drop out of those races in the future of this second half of the season. And then we have Stake Kick, which is kind of a surprise in this regard, who is now in 7th constructor standing. So from last place to up to 7th, they are looking quite strong lately, as they start off fairly poorly, but then they're starting to kick off a little bit better. Now they have a starting position of 15 as well, so they kind of coincide with Haas, and they coincide with Haas again with their finishing position of 13. So they were gaining those 2 spots, kind of like Haas is, and they've had 4 DNFs. But lately they have kind of been coming on strong. So if you take that part of it and you ignore the first part of it, then they're looking really strong for the second half of the season. So hopefully they can continue that and move forward and maybe put some pressure on those mid-tier teams and see if they can bump some of those out. So we'll have to wait for that to happen. Well, we'll have to wait to see if that happens and see how that plays out the rest of this season. And we take that team information and we break it down a little bit farther, and so we can see the drivers and where they stand in the drivers' championship, and how the drivers break out in those average starting and finishing positions as well. So here we can see the pink is, of course, Alpine, the red is Haas, the blue is the Racing Bulls, and green, of course, is the Stake F1 team. So here we can see that Jack Doohan is standing in the 21st position for the driver's standing, so just outside the top 20. So as he's fallen back, as he's kind of gotten pushed aside from that Alpine team, hasn't had a chance to really push forward in that regard. His average starting position was 14, and his average finishing position was 16. He's had 2 DNFs in that first few drive stints that he was in, And then we can compare that with Franco Colapinto, who replaced him, whose standing is 20th, and his average starting position is 16, so farther back than Jack Doohan's was, and his average finishing position was 16. So he didn't really gain any ground there either. So if you look at those, and of course he only has one DNF, so that's a plus on Franco Colapinto's side. But other than that, the standings are pretty dead even in that regard, with per chance that Jack had a little bit better qualifying, so he may have been able to get a little bit more out of the race easier than Franco Colapinto is, as he can start in that 14th position on average instead of the 16th that Franco is. Now, if you compare those two to the star of the Alpine team, Pierre Gasly, he's standing is in 14th currently, and his average starting position is 12th, and his average finishing position is 13th. So he's dropping back a little bit, but not near as much as their teammates, because that Alpine's drive in the race, so they can get a little bit more out of it in the qualifying session than the race, it looks like, for that drive speed. He also has 3 DNFs, so about the same average as the 2 other drivers that he's competing against, as they've replaced one another in that regard. So you can kind of see how they kind of team up and how they were kind of relate to one another in that regard, in that Alpine with that same hardware that they're trying to drive against. And this gives us to the Haas team, which we see Oliver Behrman in that standing 19th position for the driver standing. His starting average position was 15, and his average finishing position was 14, and he's had 2 DNFs. So as a rookie, I think this is pretty good. Yes, he's just behind his teammate on average starting position and average finishing position, but as a rookie, that's really good. Of course, he's had 1 more DNF than his more experienced teammate, but that's kind of to be expected as well. So I think he's coming along quite nicely in that regard, even though he's farther back in the field than I would have preferred. And his teammate, of course, Esteban Ocon, is currently in that 10th spot for the Drivers' Championship. So fairly decent there. And his average starting position is 14, and his average finishing position is 13 with only 1 DNF. So a little bit ahead of his teammate, as like I was saying before, but still a fairly good run for Esteban Ocon in that Haas that's kind of lagging behind a little bit as we come through these last few races before the summer break. Then we come to Liam Lawson, whose current driver standing is 15th. His average starting position is 13th, and his average finishing position for Racing Bulls is 13. And he has 3 DNFs. Now, I'm only counting the races for Racing Bulls. I'm not counting the ones for Red Bull, the first 2. And I didn't really count Yuki in this because there was only 2 races before Liam Lawson was replaced by Yuki in the Red Bull team. So it dropped back down to that team, that Racing Bulls team. So it didn't really play out as much, even though you'll see it a little bit later in the graph. So you have Isaac Hydjar, his main competitor and a rookie himself, current driver standing in 13th, so a couple spots higher than Liam Lawson, but Liam Lawson's coming on a little bit stronger in these last few races, so we'll have to see how that plays out in the second half of the season. Of course, his average starting position is 11th, so quite a bit higher, and right outside that point range of 10th, where you get a point. And his average finishing position is 12th. So he drops back a little bit, not quite maintaining that or gaining positions in that run. So he has a little bit to learn there as well. And he only has 2 DNFs, so he's only dropped out of the race twice so far. So again, for those rookies, it's a fairly good run for them, gaining the grips of those cars, getting up to speed in the full Formula One machinery and the way things work with all the buttons and dials and switches and all the things that you have to do, in the cockpit as well as outside the cockpit to try to gain the most out of those cars. So I think they're doing fairly well in this run. And then we come to Gabriel Bortoleto, who's in the 17th position for the driver standings and has an average starting position of 15 and an average finishing position of 14. And has 3 DNFs. Now his more experienced teammate in that stake F1 car, Nico Hulkenberg, his current standing is 9th in the driver's standing, so a really good job from him there. His average starting position is 16, so a little bit farther back than Gabriel Bortoletto's, but he ends up gaining that ground in the race and ending those races in 12th, which is a couple of positions higher than Gabriel Bortoletto's. And he only has one DNF as well. So a fairly good run from Nico Hülkenberg. I think if he can get that qualifying session down a little bit better on that on that Stake F1 car, he should be able to, gain a little bit more points and not have to struggle through the race to make up those positions. And I think we see Gabriel Bortoletto in those last few races really getting comfortable with that Stake car as well. And so he's coming back and kind of beating his teammate there in a lot of those circumstances as well. So we'll have to watch those pair and see how they play out in the second half of this season. So here we're going to dive down into the teams and compare the drivers for each team and where they finished up for each race compared to each other, and look at that and get those trend lines going and try to figure out where they are going in the situation. So on the y-axis, we have the finishing position, of course, and the x-axis, we have each race so far in the season. So here you can see that Jack Doohan started off, fairly poorly, but then had 3 races that were decent, and then it started falling back into that clutches and, kind of messing up a little bit. Where we see Franco Colapinto, doing roughly the same, but a little bit behind Jack Doohan in those races in that view. And then lightly has the 3 races that are fairly poor as well. Where we have Pierre Gasly, which is kind of all over the board in this situation. He's had some really good races and had some pretty bad races as well. But on average, he's going better. And of course, if you look at those trend lines, since we want to finish farther up in the front of the grid, the downward angles of those trend lines are better than the upward angles, which is kind of showing you that you're going backwards and getting farther back in that pack. So we can kind of compare Jack Doohan and Franco Colapinto, and they're kind of going back. They're not doing that great. They're getting worse as their time has gone in this season, but they're pretty close to parallel. But it looks like to me, Franco Colapinto's is getting a little bit more steeply down, into that 20th spot a little faster than Jack Doohan's is. Where we see Pierre Gasly has a slightly, corrective, trend line getting closer to that first position. Now, not a whole lot, pretty steady there, but pretty close, getting a little bit better as the first half of the season went through. So we can kind of compare those drivers and figure out, of course, Pierre Gasly is the more experienced, more dedicated driver, where the Franco Colapinto and Jack Doohan came in as, new drivers this season, and one has replaced the other and really hasn't shown that much better than Jack Doohan has in my regard. And so far, we'll have to see how that plays out for the second half of the season to see if Jack Doohan gets another chance in that Alpine, or if they decide to give that ride to someone else, or will Franco Colapinto finish off the season with Alpine. Next, we have the Haas. Of course, we have Oliver Behrman in red and Esteban Ocon in white. And so we can kind of see how they match up to each other in this first half of the season, where they kind of both started off about the same, got better on that second race. That Haas car was a little bit better in that China race, but you can see Oliver Behrman was lagging a little bit behind Ocon in that. And then Ocon had a bad race in Japan, where Oliver Behrman got worse, but it was still fairly decent in getting those points in Japan and Bahrain, whereas Esteban has jumped a little bit farther back into that running for that points. And it's kind of been back and forth, a little estimate on those, except for Esteban Ocon's getting a little bit more consistent at the end of this first half of the season, yet still dropping off where that Haas hasn't really gained the ground that they need. So both of those trend lines are going up, which is bad because they're trying to drop farther back into that 20th position, not gaining the ground that they want overall. But compared to each other, I think they're fairly good, especially considering one's a rookie and one's a more experienced driver. Those trend lines are fairly close to each other still. They haven't kind of widened out as you would might have seen in other teams. So I think they're doing decently. They just need to figure out what's going on with that Haas for the second half of the season and see if they can get those updates and working a little more consistently, and so they can move back up into that mid-team fight as they are battling out to get those extra points. And next, of course, we have the Racing Bulls, where we have Isaac Hyjar and we have Yuki in there just for 2 races, and Liam Lawson that came back replacing him after getting kicked out of the mother team of Red Bull themselves. So we can see that Yuki had a not so great start in those Racing Bulls, kind of just outside those points and then dropping back a little bit. But we can see that Liam Lawson kind of picked up from that same position and was kind of getting a little bit better, but still falling behind Isaac Hyjar until these last couple of races, where he's actually done a little bit better on outperforming Isaac Hyjar. So we'll have to see if that swing is going towards Liam Lawson over Isaac Hyjar as these races come about, or if Isaac Hyjar is going to be able to continue his run and, like the first part of the season, gain his ground and start really performing again, as he was really outstanding in the first half of the season and really showing good, except for these last few races where he's kind of toppled off, not doing so well. Hopefully he can get that momentum back for him and be able to really shine again, as he was deemed to be probably one of the contentions for the Rookie of the Year. Of course, if you look at those trend lines, we see that Liam Lawson is going much better over this first part of the season, as he started off fairly bad and was kind of getting better, even though he's had a couple of pretty bad runs at the end of the season, into this first half of the season as well. Whereas Isaac Hyjar is a lot more consistent in that beginning half, and then he's had a little bit rough time in this last few races, this last 5 races. He's kind of struggled a little bit there. So hopefully that'll turn around for him and he'll look like that first stint that he had. Of course, he had that one really bad run at the very beginning of the season where it was wet, and he killed that car right off the bat and kind of got thrown out, and he was dejected from that. But you can see that he was able to jump back into the running and really show what he can do for this first half of the season. So overall, I think Isaac Hyjar is probably the edge here, even though that Liam Lawson's going to come back and give him a run for his money in this season. So we'll have to see how those battle it out for the second half of this season. And now we compare, the Stake F1 team. So we can kind of see Gabriel Bortoleto in red and Nico Hulkenberg in green, where we had Nico Hulkenberg came out really strong this season, and then fell back for those 5 or 6 races. And then lately, he's kind of come back a little bit stronger in that Stake F1 car, whereas Gabriel Bortoleto started off fairly poorly, kind of dragging it out fairly consistently at the back of the pack, but only lately he's really coming to life and being able to get some extra points on his teammate in these races and starting to put some pressure on Hulkenberg in that running for those drivers in that Stake F1 team. So we'll have to see how that plays out again. But you look at those trend lines for both of those, and of course they're both going down, which is a good thing in this case, as they're getting closer to that first position overall. And so you can see both of those drivers, and I think that's the big key here for the Stake F1 team, is both those drivers are getting better throughout this first half of the season, which was really shining for them in this and gaining those points and getting them up to that 7th position for that team constructors standings, where we see of course Hulkenberg's had those really good runs and getting some really good points, and even getting on the podium in that Great Britain race. So he's gotten some really heavy points that's kind of outshined his teammate, but his teammate is a little bit more consistent and, of course, getting better. So we'll have to see how that plays out and see if that consistency continues as the second half of the season comes, and he just keeps getting better and better, which will put a lot more pressure on his teammate Hulkenberg, as he's a little more race to race on how well he performs. So now we're going to compare all 5 teams in a kind of a bar graph from each race, how many points they earn from each of those races. So of course we have Stake in green, Racing Bulls in blue, Haas in red, and Alpine in that pink. And I've also added some trend lines for those teams as well to figure out where those points are, gaining, to see if they're, improving throughout this first part of the season, or if they're, starting to lag behind their other teams, and so they're dropping back into those, back running things and not getting the points that they need for this constructor standings. So as you look at these trend lines, you can see Haas right off the bat, really strong at the very beginning and dropping off quite significantly throughout this first part of this half of the season. Really strong in that China race, got some decent points at Bahrain and Monaco, and dropped off a little bit in Canada, and had a few points, of course, in Japan and Austria, but really has dropped back out of those point range and scoring positions as of late, and so they're going down, which is in this case is bad because you want to get more points, and so that trend line should be going up like we see the other three teams in this run. Next, we can kind of look at the Racing Bulls, who started off fairly poorly, gaining some points, but not quite as well as they would have liked, and then had that really nice peak in Monaco and dropped back down a little bit, but they're still doing fairly well, and so they're kind of gaining that ground. And you can see that in that trend line as it's going up, second to the most team there on improving throughout this first half of the season. And of course, Alpine, having an off time here, not doing points very often, but gaining some points in Bahrain and in Spain and Great Britain, and a couple of points in Belgium as well. So they're kind of lagging behind. They're still going up slightly, but they're not going up near as much as they should be. So they still have a chance to be able to really perform in the second half of the season, get their act together to get that consistency, getting that upgrades that they need to really put pressure on the teams around them and get those points. But we'll have to see if that will play out for them, as they've been really struggling in that team, and there's a lot of turmoil over drivers and people in that team for the engineers and what else, and that may play out in the likelihood of how those team drivers are going to be able to perform the rest of this season. And then of course we have Stake F1, who's had a really good run at the very beginning, and then kind of dropped off for that first 4 or 5 races after that, and then it's come back strong at that back half of this first part of the season. So you can see them in Australia, really strong, and then they're coming laying low until Spain, where they came out and started gaining more points for each race. So they kind of came back strong at the end. So you can kind of see that they're the most gained this part of the season, and kind of going up in this first half of the season fairly strongly. So we'll have to see if they can push forward and get into that mid-tier team section and put pressure, maybe even on that top tier, but I don't think they'll even make it that far. But they may make it to the top of the mid-tier teams, which will be interesting to see if they can outpace some of those folks. So we'll have to see in the second half of the season how they perform. Now, of course, this graph is just a step graph of the previous information, just adding those points together. So throughout the year, where they lined up and where they cross each other in those constructor standings. So as you can see, right off the bat, Stake came out strong and then basically leveled off for the most part of the season, only gaining ground since Monaco. But they were gaining ground quite strong, and then jumping them up into that top position for this lower team section. Whereas Alpine got a couple of points in Bahrain, but then was steady until until Spain, before gaining a couple more points, and then again in Great Britain and a little bit in Belgium as well. So they're kind of lagging behind the rest of those teams, so they're in the last place, where we see Haas is really up front in this first part of the season, gaining ground right off the bat in China, and get a little bit more in Japan and Bahrain, and then going fairly good in Monaco, and gaining a point or two in Canada and Austria to make it that next to last team, but still a fairly good run for them. If they can gain some of that momentum that they had at the very beginning of the season, I think they'll do fairly well this season. But we'll have to see if that can get rebought into or not. And of course we have the Racing Bulls, who started off decently, I guess, and a little bit gaining a point or two here, but not really where they needed to be. But then really picked up since they hit Monaco and Imola, gaining ground quite significantly in those last part of the season. So they'll have that momentum to move into that second half of the season to see if they can put some more pressure on Stake in that running or not. And of course, Stake was really bad, as I said, at the first part of the season, and then really gained ground in the second part of the season. So this is that nice little graph that kind of shows you at what points, they were competing against each other and where they gained the ground on the other teams, so that you can kind of see where they play out and see what their trend upward momentum looks like, or how things are going to go for the second half of this season. So as I said, we have a 3-week summer break. So next week I will try to get a mid-tier team ranking, just like this one for the low teams, which will include, Stake F1 in that running, as we'll have a little bit of overlap so we can kind of see how they compare to the next 3 teams in that line. So we'll kind of run through that before we get to the top tier as well. So until then, I will see you on the grid, and farewell.